I mean, if you think about it and you imagine money, and so anybody listening to this now and you say, okay, draw me a mental picture of money, people still generally think of notes and coins or even gold, whereas of course 98% of money in circulation in Britain today, and I think the figure is very similar in Germany or even higher in a country like Sweden. The vast majority of money in circulation doesn't take the form of notes and coins, it takes the form of claims made through the banking system and often mediated by plastic cards of one form or another. So once you start thinking of money in more abstract terms and you start thinking it's not just notes and coins, it's actually just a series of claims, then you begin to understand that money has a kind of dynamic quality, and it's more like a verb than a noun actually. That money is actually just a series of claims that move between people. This sort of weather, cloudy but light, appreciate the sun is out there somewhere. I would at home be able to run my washing machine of the power that you get off the roof at this time. Solar is not just about PV, solar energy produces the wind as well and produces the biogas that can provide the backup to both wind and PV. Even at night time, all my electricity at home is solar. My lights haven't gone off in last 2 years that I'll have been having my supply from them. PV provides power when we need it most. It peaks, as we all know, about midday when the sun is highest in the sky, and that's actually when the demand for electricity is at its most when we are cooking lunch, and in Germany they have shown that it not only peaks at the right time but the PV power follows the shape of demand. At the moment in Germany around noon at time of peak demand when electricity is actually most expensive, the PV that they get has reduced the price, the wholesale price of electricity on the grid considerably. So we walked up to north side of the square. What is it in particular that takes your interest here? Well, I wanted to show you the bust above the entrance doorway. This is where the students of the Courtauld Institute of Arts come, and on the other side of course visitors to the Courtauld Gallery will go in there, and I'm guessing they don't look up to see this interesting bust. You probably can't recognize who it is supposed to be. No idea actually. Well, it is the great English scientist Isaac Newton. The reason that he is here is because this part of Somerset House, which is called the Strand Block, when it was built from the 1770s through to the 1790s, it was purpose-built to be the home of three learned societies. They were the Royal Society, the Society of Antiquaries, so they were essentially historians, and the Royal Academy of Arts, which was just a very new organization, just a few years old at the time, which looked after architecture, sculpture and painting. The Royal Society were housed on this side, and that's why they chose Isaac Newton, who had been dead for about 50 years by then.
I'm going to talk about a train that exemplifies the rise and fall of passenger trains in the United States, the 20th Century Limited. Let me go back just a bit. In 1893, a special train was established to take people from New York to an exposition in Chicago. It was so successful that regular service was then set up between these cities. The inaugural trip of the 20th Century Limited was made in 1902. The train was different from what anyone had ever seen before. It was pulled by a steam engine and had 5 cars, 2 sleepers, a dining car, an observation car, and a baggage car, which, believe it or not, contained a library. The 42 passengers the train could carry were waited on by a large staff. There were even secretaries and a barber on board. It wasn't long before people had to wait 2 years to get a reservation. As time passed, technical improvements shortened the trip by a few hours. Perhaps the biggest technological change occurred in 1945, the switch from steam to diesel engines. By the 1960s, people were traveling by car and airplane. Unfortunately, the great old train didn't survive until the end of the century it was named for.
The winds of a tornado are the most violent and destructive ones on Earth. Any of you who have seen one knows very well how frightening and powerful they are. What's interesting about them is that scientists don't actually know exactly why tornadoes occur. We do know, however, what happens when tornadoes are formed. As you remember, a front occurs when cool, dry air from the north meets warm, humid air coming from the south, from the Gulf of Mexico for tornadoes in the United States. Where these air masses meet, a narrow zone of storm clouds develops, and thunderstorms, and sometimes tornadoes, occur. How is this violent weather produced? Well, a mass of warm, humid air rises very rapidly. As it rises, more warm air rushes in to replace it. This inrushing air also rises, and in some cases, especially when there is extreme thermal instability, begins to rotate. When this happens, the rotating air forms a tornado. Even if you've seen tornadoes only in movies, you know that they can demolish buildings in seconds. This is possible because when a tornado passes over a house, it sucks up air from around the house, and so the air pressure outside the house drops rapidly. Inside, pressure remains the same. So air pressure inside is greater than air pressure outside. The result is that the building explodes outward. Next, we'll talk a little bit about how new technological developments are being used to try to predict tornadoes.
Okay, as you look at this next exhibit, you'll notice something quite common, an ordinary bar of soap. Now, soap has been around a long time. In fact, the ancient Phoenicians produced soap as a substance for washing the body way back in 600 BC. They made it by blending goat's fat with wood ash. The Phoenicians, as you may know, regularly traded along the Mediterranean, and they were the ones who introduced soap to the Greeks and Romans. Now, soap was not something welcomed by all countries. In fact, during the superstitious Middle Ages, many people were afraid to bathe their whole body too frequently. They thought it could be dangerous for their health, that it could even kill them. And even after the production of soap became common in some European countries in the 11th and 12th centuries, even then some people in the heart of Europe refused to use it. You'll find it interesting that when a duchess was given a box of soap as a present in 1549, she was so insulted that she had the gift-giver thrown off her estate. But by the 19th century, the attitude toward soap had changed drastically. In some regions of Europe, the tax on soap was so high that people secretly made their own. A baron went so far as to suggest that the wealth of a nation could be judged according to the amount of soap it used. Now, if you turn your attention to the next exhibit, you can see how soap is manufactured today.
There are many definitions of what the economic globalization is, but an important aspect of most is that it involves reducing or removing the barriers limiting the free movement of business, trade, exports and imports, investment and even labor across national borders. First, globalization means the increase in international trade transactions and multinational companies across the border. Secondly, globalization represents an integrated economic system than ever before. Some countries produce goods, and some consume goods, which means one country's economy may depend on another country more transactions across countries. But in the past, they are economic independent while they are now parts of global economy.
I don't know why that was taught in medical school, but it was considered to be a fat-soluble vitamin and therefore stored in the body, and it would act for a long period of time and it would build up and you get into trouble. But now, in recent years, when we've had the technology to measure fat content of vitamin D, we find there's not much there. And the reason there's not much there is there's not much coming into the diet, or we are avoiding sun. So we have less vitamin D, and therefore our fat tissue does too. It's not stored up there in high concentrations. You don't begin to store vitamin D in fat until you begin to build it up in the serum, and that doesn't occur until you already have relatively high 25-hydroxy-D values. Now, it's at this point you begin to accumulate fat. And if you were out here, you'd probably have a very healthy fat concentration of D, but not very many people are out there. These are studies that were done under controlled circumstances where we could control how much was coming in and what the concentrations were under the circumstances. But the one thing students seem to recall is that fat-soluble vitamins can produce intoxication, therefore you have to be careful.
The amount of money drug companies spend on TV ads has doubled in recent years. Studies show they work. Consumers go to their doctor with a suggestion for a certain prescription drug they saw advertised on TV. Now a study in the Annals of Family Medicine raises questions about the message the ads promote. You're most likely to see drug ads during prime time, especially around the news. Researchers analyzed ads aimed at people with conditions like hypertension, herpes, high cholesterol, depression, arthritis and allergies. The drug industry says the ads arm consumers with information. Researchers found that the information was technically accurate, but the tone was misleading. Typically, what we would see with these ads is that before taking a particular prescription drug, the character's life is out of control and the loss of control extended beyond the impact of their health condition, says UCLA psychologist Dominic Frosch, who headed the study. For example, herpes patients were portrayed as being incapacitated for days. Insomniacs were utterly out of 23 sync on the job. Depressed patients were friendless and boring at parties. When the character is then shown taking the drug, he then magically regains complete control of his life, Frosch notes. None of the ads mentioned lifestyle changes that could also help treat the condition. That's not surprising, given that the ads are just another form of mass marketing. But prescription medicines are not soap. Before we consider international environmental law and climate change, we need to consider domestic legislation, as it is within the sovereign states that international law is put into practice. This reflects the environmentalists' maxim, think globally, act locally. United Kingdom legislative control over the impacts of MONS activity on the environment is not new. As long ago as the reign of Charles II, the main concern was the production of smoke from the burning of sea coal. Almost all areas of trade and industry were subject to very detailed legislative controls at that time, although some were governed by self-regulation in the form of guilds, who regulated both supply and methods of production. However, the measures implemented were mostly ineffective because then, as now, the specifying of legal duties and standards without providing any appropriate enforcement merely indicated good intentions but were of little practical effect. The next stage was prompted by the Industrial Revolution with the urbanization of society and its profound effects on the environment. Local industrialists used the Adam Smith model to maximize their economic benefit, but this was to the detriment of the local environment with the operation of Gresham's law, that is, the bad drives out the good. Those industrialists who were concerned for either the health of their employees or the local environment faced higher costs than their competitors. The result was the need for increasingly comprehensive statutory controls on the discharge of pollutants into various receiving media.